Hey guys, welcome back to our little quiet corner of the internet. Tonight we're going to be talking about a figure that's been so heavily romanticized, so steeped in legend and myth, that the reality is often much more fascinating. We're going to be talking about the samurai. But we're not starting on a windswept battlefield or in a duel under cherry blossoms. No, our story begins much earlier, in a quiet paper-walled room, with the birth of a child. We're going to explore the incredible, almost unbelievably rigorous process that took a small boy and forged him, piece by piece, into a warrior, a scholar, and a living embodiment of an ancient code. It's a story of remarkable resilience, of grit and ingenuity that is almost hard to comprehend from our modern world of comforts. Before we begin that journey, if you enjoy what I do here, and only if you genuinely find it helpful for quietening your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. It just helps our quiet community grow, and as always, I love to know where you're all listening from. It's a wonderful thought, all of us scattered across the globe, sharing this little moment of peace together, so drop a comment if you feel like it. Now, let's get ready. Go ahead and dim the lights, pull up a blanket, and let the noise of your day begin to fade. Get comfortable, find that perfect spot on your pillow, and let's travel back together to feudal Japan to witness the making of a samurai. Our story doesn't begin with a choice. For a boy born into the samurai class, there was no career day, no guidance counselor asking, "So what are your passions?" His passion was chosen for him the moment he drew his first breath. He was born into a rigid social hierarchy, a caste system, where his entire life, his duties, his loyalties, and even the way he was expected to die were all predetermined. He was a link in a chain, stretching back through generations of ancestors whose portraits and armor might still adorn the walls of his family home. The weight of that lineage was a constant silent pressure. It wasn't the boisterous pressure of a modern family hoping you'll get into a good college. It was a deep, spiritual obligation to not bring shame upon a name that had been carried with honor for centuries. Failure wasn't just personal. It was a stain on the memory of his father, his grandfather, and everyone who came before. The world he was born into was one of profound, intentional quiet and simplicity. A samurai household, especially one of some standing, was not a place of clutter. It was a world of clean lines, of polished dark wood floors that felt cool underfoot, of translucent paper screens, or shoji, that divided rooms and turned the harsh afternoon sun into a soft ethereal glow. The air itself smelled different. It was a mix of the dry, grassy scent of the tatami mats that covered the floors, the faint aroma of cedarwood from the architecture, and perhaps the subtle fragrance of incense burning in a small alcove. The sounds were muted, the swish of a silk kimono as his mother walked by, the soft rhythmic shuffling of feet in tabby socks across the mats, the distant chirp of a cricket in the garden. This wasn't a world of loud noises and constant stimulation. It was an environment designed for contemplation, for focus, where every object had a place and a purpose. This was the canvas upon which his life would be painted. Even in infancy, the conditioning began. He wasn't just a baby to be coddled. He was a future warrior, a vessel for the family's honor. His upbringing, overseen by his mother, and perhaps a wet nurse, was a careful balance of affection and unyielding discipline. Crying without reason was not to be indulged. Fear of a loud noise or a strange face was to be gently but firmly corrected. The goal was to instill a sense of calm stoicism from the very beginning. His toys were not the soft, harmless playthings we might imagine. He might be given a small, beautifully carved wooden horse to instill a love of cavalry, or a miniature bow too small to be dangerous but perfect for training the eye and the hand. One of the most significant moments of these early years would have been his first introduction to the family's swords. The daisho. These were not just weapons, they were the soul of the samurai. They wouldn't have been handed to him to play with. Instead, he would have been brought before the polished stand where they rested, perhaps in the family's main hall. He would have been taught to bow, to show reverence. He would learn that these objects contained the honor of his entire lineage. He could look, but not touch. It was an exercise in instilling profound respect and a deep, almost mystical connection to the tools that would one day define his existence. This was the samurai equivalent of being shown a sacred religious text for the first time. The message was clear: this is who you are, and this is what you will become. Around the age of 5 or 6, the world for our young boy would begin to change dramatically. The gentle, playful learning of his earliest years would begin to crystallize into a formal, demanding, and often punishing regimen of education. The shift from play to discipline was swift and absolute, and the first great mountain he had to climb was literacy. We take reading and writing for granted, but for a young Japanese boy of the era, it was a Herculean task. He had to learn not one, but multiple complex writing systems and thousands upon thousands of Chinese characters, known as kanji. Each character was a small, intricate picture with multiple meanings and pronunciations. This wasn't learning your ABCs. This was an exercise in pure, unadulterated memorization and precision. And the tool for this was the brush. The art of calligraphy, or shodo, was inseparable from literacy. It was considered a window into a person's soul. A clumsy, ill-formed character was seen as a sign of a clumsy, ill-formed mind. So the training was relentless. He would spend hours a day, sitting in the formal Caesar position, kneeling with his legs folded beneath him, a posture that itself is an exercise in endurance, learning the simple, perfect elegance of a single stroke. He would learn how to grind his own ink on an inkstone, mixing the dry stick with water until it reached the perfect consistency, a task that in itself teaches patience. He would feel the weight of the bamboo brush in his hand, learning how a subtle shift in pressure could change the thickness of a line from a powerful, bold statement to a whisper-thin flourish. He would draw the same character, over and over and over again, until his master was satisfied. Hundreds of repetitions, thousands. The muscles in his hand would ache, his back would scream from the rigid posture, his mind would wander, and that was the point. Calligraphy wasn't just about writing, it was a form of moving meditation. It was about training the mind to achieve a state of absolute focus, to block out all distractions and pour all of one's being into a single perfect action. It was the first foundational lesson in the mental discipline that would govern his entire life. To a modern mind, it seems incredibly tedious, a task that would make our standardized tests look like a friendly suggestion over a cup of tea. But for the samurai, this was forging the mind. A mind that could remain calm and focused while drawing a character was a mind that could, one day, remain calm and focused in the chaos of battle. Alongside this intense training in writing, his mind was being filled with the great literary and philosophical works of the age. While a modern child might be moving on to simple chapter books, our young samurai in training was being introduced to the great Chinese classics. He would be studying the works of Confucius, learning about ethics, loyalty, filial piety, and the proper order of society. These weren't just stories, they were the moral and philosophical bedrock of his entire world. And most critically, he would be introduced to works of military strategy. Imagine being 7 or 8 years old and having Sun Tzu's The Art of War as your required reading. He was learning about deception, logistics, terrain, and the psychology of an enemy before he had even fully mastered his own multiplication tables. This diet of Confucian ethics and brutal military pragmatism created a fascinating duality in the samurai mind. On one hand, he was taught to be a gentleman, to be polite, cultured and just. On the other, he was taught to be a ruthlessly effective warrior, to understand that victory required cunning and sometimes cruelty. He was learning about statecraft, betrayal, and the harsh realities of power politics at an age when his emotional world was still developing. It was an education designed to strip away childish innocence and replace it with a sober, serious understanding of the world and his place within it. And this knowledge wasn't just to be read and understood, it was to be memorized. Rote memorization was a cornerstone of his education. He would be expected to recite long, complex passages of prose, historical accounts and poetry, verbatim. This was more than just a memory exercise. In a culture where honor and precedent were everything, knowing history wasn't just academic, it was practical. It provided a library of examples of virtuous behavior, of strategic genius, and of shameful failure. When faced with a difficult choice later in life, a samurai was expected to be able to recall a similar situation from a historical text and act accordingly. His mind was being turned into a living archive of the warrior code. The education was what historians would politely call rigorous. In modern terms, it was a mental and intellectual boot camp of epic proportions, designed to build not just a knowledgeable man, but a wise and decisive one. As he moved towards the age of 10, the focus of his training would begin a major shift. While the academic and philosophical studies continued, the forging of his physical self would now begin in earnest. The hours spent with a brush in his hand would now be matched, and often surpassed, by hours spent with a wooden sword. This was the beginning of the long, arduous journey to master the martial arts, the bujutsu, that with a practical application of his station in life, the dojo became his second home, a simple, spacious hall of polished wood, often open to a garden on one side, a place of profound discipline and controlled violence. And his first and most constant companion in this world would be the bokken, a heavy, unforgiving wooden sword, carved from oak or another hardwood, to mimic the weight and balance of a real katana. To a child it felt impossibly heavy, clumsy. It was not a toy. A solid strike from a bokken could easily break bones, and he would learn this fact quickly, both by receiving and, inevitably, by giving bruises. The splinters, the aching muscles, the sharp sting of a rap across the knuckles from his master for a moment of inattention. These were his new teachers. The training began with the absolute basics, stances, or kamae. He would be forced to hold these stances low, wide, and physically demanding, for what felt like an eternity. His legs would tremble, burning with lactic acid. His arms would ache from holding the bokken aloft. Any lapse in form, any sign of weakness would be met with a sharp correction. This wasn't about learning to fight. It was about deconstructing his body's natural, undisciplined movements and rebuilding them from the ground up. It was about creating a foundation of perfect balance, of rootedness to the earth, from which all other techniques would spring. It was mind-numbingly repetitive. It was exhausting, and it was absolutely essential. From stances he would move to footwork, learning to glide across the dojo floor, to pivot, to advance and retreat with a grace and economy of motion that belied the effort involved. And then came the kata. These were pre-arranged sequences of movements, a sort of moving meditation with the sword. They were a library of techniques, blocks, parries and strikes, all woven together into a dance of deadly precision. He would practice these kata thousands upon thousands of times, over months and years. At first it would be a clumsy imitation of his instructor, but slowly, with endless repetition, the movements would begin to sink past his conscious mind, deep into his muscle memory. The goal was for the sword to become an extension of his will, for his body to react instantly, perfectly, without the need for thought. Thought was too slow for a real duel. The body had to know what to do on its own. There would be a day, a profound milestone, when he was finally allowed to hold a real sword for the first time. Not a live, razor-sharp blade, but an Aito, a blunted steel training sword. The difference would be electric. The sudden, serious weight of it, the way the balance shifted from the solid wood of the bokken to the nuanced distribution of the steel blade, the cold, smooth feel of the metal. It was a moment that transformed the abstract training into a tangible reality. This was no longer a game of sticks. This was a rehearsal for death. Holding it, he would feel the weight not just of the metal, but of the responsibility that came with it. But the sword, for all its iconic status, was not the only weapon in a samurai's arsenal. In many ways, on the chaotic scrum of a medieval battlefield, it was a secondary weapon. He would also have to master the spear, the art of sojutsu. The yari, the Japanese spear, was a long and often unwieldy weapon, sometimes stretching to 15 feet or more. For a young boy, learning to control its length and weight was a monumental challenge in balance and leverage. He would learn to use its reach to keep enemies at a distance, the brutal efficiency of a thrust compared to a cut. He'd practice in formations, learning to fight as part of a cohesive unit of spearmen, a living wall of sharpened steel points. It lacked the romantic elegance of the sword, but its practical, life-saving value was drilled into him. Then there was the bow. The Japanese bow, the yumi, is a beautiful and unusual weapon. It's an asymmetric longbow, with the grip positioned about 1/3 of the way from the bottom. He would learn that this unique design was a brilliant piece of engineering, developed to allow a long, powerful bow to be wielded from horseback without the bottom limb getting tangled in the saddle. Mastering it required immense physical strength. The draw weight of a warbow was significant. and he would have to build the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders through endless repetition. He would stand for hours, drawing the bowstring back, holding and releasing, long before he was ever allowed to shoot an arrow. It was another exercise in patience and form. He would learn to focus on his breathing, to find the still point within himself before letting the arrow fly. He would listen for the satisfying thwump as it struck the straw target, a sound that was a reward for perfect form and a quiet mind. Of course, a warrior could be disarmed, and so he also trained extensively in unarmed combat, or jujutsu. This was the art of the last resort, but it was studied with the same seriousness as any other martial discipline. It wasn't about punching and kicking in the way we might think of modern martial arts. It was a grimly practical science of throws, joint locks, chokes, and grappling. He would learn to use an opponent's size and momentum against them, to exploit the weak points of the human body. He would spend hours on the mats, being thrown and learning how to fall without injury, feeling the painful, precise pressure of a joint lock. He learned that a fight wasn't always won with brute strength, but with superior technique and an intimate knowledge of anatomy and leverage. This was the original use your opponent's momentum against them, long before it became a popular catchphrase in action movies. And no samurai training was complete without mastering the art of horsemanship, or bujutsu. A samurai of any standing was a mounted warrior. The horse was his partner in battle, his means of transportation, his status symbol. He had to become as comfortable in the saddle as he was on his own 2 feet. This meant endless hours of riding, in all weather, over all terrains. He would learn the ache in his thighs, the chafing of the saddle, the bone-deep weariness that comes from a long day's ride, but he would also learn the exhilaration of it, the feeling of power and freedom. He would learn to guide the horse not just with the reins, but with the pressure of his knees and the shifting of his weight, leaving his hands free for his weapons. And this led to one of the most difficult martial skills of all, archery from horseback. This was a feat of almost superhuman coordination. Imagine trying to solve a complex puzzle while riding a roller coaster, and you have some idea of the difficulty. He had to control a powerful, galloping animal with his legs, draw a heavy bow, aim at a moving target, and release, all in a matter of seconds. It required a perfect synthesis of rider and horse, a unity of purpose that could only be achieved through years of relentless practice. It was the pinnacle of the mounted warrior's art. There was one final, terrifying piece of his physical training, one that perfectly encapsulates the samurai mindset, learning to swim while wearing armor. It was called Suie Jutsu. You have to picture this. He would be clad in dozens of pounds of lacquered metal plates, silk cords, and heavy fabrics. He would then be expected to enter the water, a cold lake or a rushing river, and not only stay afloat but actually maneuver. The armor, his protection on land, became a sentient enemy in the water, a dead weight that wanted nothing more than to drag him down to the bottom. It was a brutal test of physical endurance, and more importantly, of mental fortitude. He had to fight the primal, screaming panic in his own mind, the instinct to thrash and struggle which would only exhaust him faster. He had to learn to remain calm, to use controlled, efficient movements, to work with the water rather than against it. It was a living metaphor for his entire training. In the face of a life-threatening situation, panic is death. Calm, disciplined control is survival. This relentless physical conditioning was, however, only one half of the equation. Parallel to this, and perhaps even more important, was the deliberate and systematic hardening of his mind. The ultimate goal of a samurai's education was to cultivate a profound indifference, or fudoshin, the immovable mind, an indifference to pain, to hardship, and ultimately to death itself. This was not something that could be taught from a book. It had to be forged in the crucible of experience. So his life was intentionally made difficult. The modern concept of a comfortable childhood was utterly alien. He would be roused from sleep before dawn, in the coldest hour of the morning. He might be forced to douse himself with buckets of icy water, even in the depths of winter, a practice called mizugori. His meals would often be simple and meager, a bit of rice, some pickled vegetables, perhaps a small piece of fish. It wasn't that the family couldn't afford more. It was a deliberate choice to teach his body that it did not need comfort, that it could function and thrive on the barest of necessities. He might be sent on long errands on foot, sometimes barefoot, in the snow or the blistering summer heat, to build his endurance and teach him to ignore physical discomfort. The samurai wellness trend, if you could call it that, was less about organic smoothies and more about deliberately making yourself miserable to build character. But the most chilling aspect of this mental hardening was the normalization of death. A samurai was expected to live with death as his constant companion, to see it not as a terrifying end, but as a potential and honorable outcome of his duty. To achieve this, a young boy would be deliberately exposed to the grim realities of his world. He might be taken to watch public executions. He would be made to stand there and witness the act, to see life extinguished in an instant. He would be forced to confront the sight, the sound, and the smell of it, until it no longer provoked a powerful emotional reaction. After a battle, he might be sent to the field to look upon the dead, to see the gruesome aftermath of the violence he was being trained to inflict. The purpose of this shocking exposure was to inoculate him against fear, to strip away the horror of death and replace it with a cold, detached acceptance. He was being taught that his own life was a tool to be used in the service of his Lord, and that its preservation was secondary to the fulfillment of his duty. To balance this brutal conditioning, he would also be introduced to the practices of Zen Buddhism. Meditation, or zazen, became a crucial tool. He would be taught to sit, just as he did for calligraphy, in perfect stillness, and to empty his mind. For a restless boy full of energy, this was perhaps the most difficult training of all, to sit still and try to think of nothing, to let thoughts arise and pass without judgment, like clouds drifting across the sky. The goal was to achieve a state of mushin, or no mind, a state of pure awareness where the ego dissolves and action becomes spontaneous and perfect. It was in these quiet moments of meditation that he found the inner stillness to complement the outer violence of his martial training. It was the calm eye at the center of the hurricane of his life. This entire decade-long process of intense, all-consuming training culminated in a single profound ceremony, the Genpuku. This was his coming-of-age ritual, usually held sometime between the ages of 13 and 16. It was the moment he officially crossed the threshold from boy to man, from trainee to samurai. The ceremony was rich with symbolism. He would be given his adult name, a new name to mark his new identity. The boyish forelock of his hair would be shaved off, and the remaining hair would be oiled and tied up into the traditional adult topknot, the chomage. He would be presented with his first suit of real armor, a piece of art in itself, crafted specifically for him. But the centerpiece of the Genpuku, the moment the entire ceremony revolved around, was the bestowing of his daisho. For the first time, he would be given his own swords, a long sword, the katana, and a shorter companion sword, the wakizashi. These were not blunted training weapons. These were live blades, forged by a master smith, folded thousands of times, sharpened to a terrifying razor edge. When he took them, he would feel their true weight, a weight he had been preparing for his entire life. He might draw the katana just a few inches from its lacquered scabbard, the seira, and see the gleam of the hardened steel, the beautiful wavy line of the temper, the hamon, which was the smith's signature. In that moment, everything would come together. The years of calligraphic precision, the philosophical lessons of loyalty and honor, the endless hours in the dojo, the cold mornings, the brutal training, it all led to this. He was no longer a boy playing at being a warrior. He was a samurai. He was now responsible for upholding the honor of his family. He now carried, at his waist, the power of life and death. The swords were not just a badge of rank, they were the physical manifestation of his soul, the embodiment of his commitment to the code of Bushido. He would feel an immense sense of pride, the culmination of all his hard work, but beneath that, there would also be a cold, sobering understanding of the burden he had just accepted. His childhood was, in that moment, officially over. The young man who walked away from that ceremony was a completely different creature from the child who had started the journey. He had been systematically deconstructed and rebuilt. His body was a finely honed weapon, capable of incredible feats of endurance and skill. His mind was a fortress, conditioned to withstand pain, hardship and fear. He was a scholar, well versed in literature and strategy. He was an artist, capable of composing poetry or creating a beautiful piece of calligraphy. He was a practitioner of Zen, able to find stillness in the midst of chaos, This process, this forging of a soul, is almost impossible for us to imagine from our modern perspective. We think of childhood as a time of freedom, of discovery, of finding oneself. The samurai childhood was the complete opposite. It was a time of constraint, of discipline, of being molded into a predefined form. There was no room for individuality in the way we understand it. His identity was his function. His purpose was his duty. And yet, it would be a mistake to see this as a life devoid of meaning. In its own way, it was a life of profound purpose. Every action, from the way he bowed, to the way he held his chopsticks, to the way he drew his sword, was infused with a sense of gravity and intention. He was part of a tradition, a living continuation of an ideal that had been centuries in the making. He was taught that self-mastery was the highest virtue, and his entire upbringing was a relentless quest for it. The world he stepped into as a new adult was a complex one, a world of shifting allegiances, of political intrigue, and the ever-present possibility of sudden violent conflict. He was now expected to navigate this world with the wisdom of the sages he had studied, the courage of the heroes he had read about, and the deadly skill he had spent a lifetime acquiring. The training was never truly over, of course. He would continue to practice his martial arts, to study, to meditate, for the rest of his life. But the foundation had been laid. The boy was gone, and in his place stood a samurai, ready to serve his lord, to uphold his honor, and to face whatever fate had in store for him. As you settle deeper into your pillow now, and let this story wash over you, think of the profound silence of that training, the quiet concentration of the dojo, broken only by the sharp clap of wooden swords and the instructor's cry, the silent hours spent grinding ink brush in hand, the deep stillness of meditation before the sun had even risen. It was out of this immense quiet, this focused and deliberate world, that the legendary figure of the samurai was born, not in a flash of brilliant inspiration, but through a slow, patient and deliberate process, a soul forged not in fire, but in stillness, in one breath, one brushstroke, one perfectly repeated motion at a time. Chapter 2: The Way of the Warrior. Bushido and daily life in a time of peace. So our young samurai has passed his coming-of-age ceremony. He now wears the two swords, the daisho, that are the unmistakable mark of his class. His training is, for all intents and purposes, complete. He is a walking, breathing weapon, a scholar, a practitioner of the arts, forged in a crucible of discipline that we can barely comprehend. He is ready, ready for battle, ready for service, ready to give his life for his lord, and he walks out into a world that for the most part has absolutely no use for him. This is the great and often unspoken irony of the most famous period of the samurai, the Edo or Tokugawa period, which lasted for over 250 years, from the early 1600s to the late 1800s. After centuries of brutal, near-constant civil war, the country had finally been unified under the iron fist of the Tokugawa shogunate, and with that unification came a long, enforced peace. The very thing that society strives for, stability, order, an end to bloodshed, became a source of a quiet, creeping existential crisis for the very men who were supposed to be its enforcers. They were a class of professional warriors with no war to fight. They were experts in a craft that was rapidly becoming obsolete. And so the central conflict for our newly minted samurai was not going to be on a battlefield against a rival clan. It was going to be an internal one. The struggle was to find meaning, to maintain a warrior's identity, in a world that increasingly demanded he be a bureaucrat, a clerk, a functionary. To navigate this strange new world, he had one guiding star, one philosophical framework that gave his life its structure and its meaning. It was the unwritten code that we have come to know as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Now, it's important to understand that Bushido wasn't a single book that every samurai was issued, like a corporate employee handbook. It was a fluid, evolving set of moral and ethical principles, developed over centuries, that defined the ideal conduct of a samurai. It was a blend of Confucian ethics, Zen Buddhist introspection, and the practical, hard-won wisdom of the battlefield. In an age of peace, this code became more important than ever. When you can no longer prove your worth by your actions in combat, you must prove it by the perfection of your character. Bushido became a kind of performance, a way of living that constantly demonstrated one's readiness, one's discipline, one's adherence to the warrior ideal, even if the only enemy you faced all day was a stack of paperwork. Let's just gently peel back the layers of this code and see how these lofty ideals collided with the often mundane and sometimes absurd reality of a peacetime samurai's life. The first, and perhaps most central virtue was gai. This is often translated as justice or rectitude. It was the power of decisive and correct action. A samurai was supposed to possess an unwavering moral compass, to know the right thing to do without hesitation, and to do it, the ideal was a man who could see a complex situation, instantly discern the honorable path, and walk it, regardless of the personal cost. He was to be a paragon of fairness in his dealings with others. That's the beautiful, clean theory. The reality, of course, was a lot messier. For our young samurai, justice wasn't usually about defending a village from bandits. It was about navigating the treacherous, shark-infested waters of clan politics. His world was a rigid hierarchy, and his career, his family's income, his entire future depended on his relationship with his superiors. So what does justice mean when your immediate superior, a man you are sworn to obey, asks you to falsify a report on rice yields to make his own district look better? What is the right action when two higher-ranking samurai are engaged in a petty feud, and siding with one will make a powerful enemy of the other? Suddenly, the clear, shining line of rectitude becomes a blurry, tangled mess. He discovered that the real world was less about grand moral choices and more about 1,000 daily compromises. His training taught him to be a straight sword, but the world required him to bend, and this created a constant, low-level tension in his life. The gap between the perfect ideal of Ji and the pragmatic, often dishonorable choices required for simple survival and advancement within the system. Next came Yu, or courage. This is the one we most associate with the samurai. The image of the warrior charging into a hail of arrows, sword held high, without a trace of fear. And certainly, that was the ideal. He was trained from childhood to master his fear, to face death with a calm, serene acceptance. But in an era of peace, where were the opportunities to display this kind of spectacular courage? For the vast majority of samurai during the Tokugawa period, the most dangerous thing they faced on a daily basis was the risk of a paper cut. So the very definition of courage had to be recalibrated. Courage was no longer just about the battlefield. It became the courage to endure, the courage to stand guard at a castle gate for an 8-hour shift, in the freezing rain or the blistering heat, without flinching, without complaining, without showing any sign of weakness, all while being consumed by a soul-crushing boredom. It was the courage to maintain a stoic, dignified appearance even when your family was struggling financially. Samurai were paid in a fixed stipend of rice, and as the economy shifted towards currency, many samurai families, especially those of lower rank, found themselves in a state of genteel poverty. The courage, then, was to face your creditors with a calm demeanor, to never let the mask of samurai impassivity slip, even when you were filled with anxiety and shame. It was a quieter, more desperate kind of bravery, the courage to face a life that was not what you were promised, not what you were trained for, and to do so with unwavering grace. If you've ever had to sit through a truly pointless 3-hour meeting at work with a smile on your face, you have a tiny, microscopic inkling of the kind of courage a peacetime samurai had to cultivate every single day. Then we have Jin, which means benevolence or compassion. This is a fascinating and often contradictory part of the code. The ideal samurai was not supposed to be a mindless brute. He was meant to be a protector of the people, a gentle and compassionate ruler to those beneath him. In the words of one samurai text, the compassion of a samurai is shown by sticking his sword back in its scabbard. He was to use his immense power and privilege for the good of society. This is a lovely thought, but it existed alongside a terrifying reality. A samurai's power over commoners, farmers, artisans, merchants, was absolute. The most chilling expression of this was a legal right known as kiri sute gomen, which translates chillingly to permission to cut down and discard. This meant that a samurai could, legally, strike down a commoner who had insulted him, or failed to show the proper respect, and face no legal consequences, provided he could produce a witness and report the incident immediately. Now, this right was not used capriciously or frequently. To do so would be seen as a sign of poor self-control and would bring shame on a samurai. But the fact that it existed at all created an enormous, unbridgeable chasm between the samurai class and everyone else. It was a constant, terrifying reminder of the power imbalance. So while our young samurai may have been taught the ideal of benevolence, he was also keenly aware that his very presence could, and was meant to, inspire fear. He was to be a compassionate protector, but one who also possessed the legal right to kill you for a perceived slight. It's a paradox that lies at the heart of many authoritarian systems. The benevolence of the powerful is a gift, not a right, and it can be withdrawn in an instant. Perhaps the most all-consuming of the virtues, in terms of daily life, was rei. This means respect, or politeness, but the English words don't even begin to capture the depth and complexity of it. Rei was the intricate, exhaustive, and utterly non-negotiable system of etiquette that governed every single interaction. It was a social grammar of staggering complexity. The goal was to create a perfectly smooth, frictionless society where everyone knew their place and acted accordingly, preventing any kind of conflict before it could even begin. Bowing is the most obvious example. It wasn't just a simple nod. There were dozens of different bows, and choosing the wrong one could be a serious, even dangerous faux pas. There was the quick 15-degree nod you might give to a social equal you passed in a corridor. There was the deeper 45-degree bow for a superior. There was the full 90-degree bow, the saikire, from a seated position on the floor, forehead nearly touching the tatami mat, which was reserved for the daimyo or shogun. The depth of the bow, the duration of the bow, who bowed first, who rose first, all of it was minutely choreographed based on the relative social standing of the two people involved. It was a constant, silent calculation of status. For our young samurai, every single day was a minefield of potential social blunders. Walking through the castle was like navigating a complex algorithm of deference. You could probably get a PhD today just studying the bowing protocols of a single daimyo's court. This obsession with form reached its ultimate expression in the Japanese tea ceremony, the chanyu. To the uninitiated, it looks like a very slow, very fussy way to make a cup of bitter green tea. But for the samurai, it was a profound spiritual practice. It was the embodiment of rei. Every single object in the tea room, the iron kettle, the bamboo whisk, the ceramic bowl was chosen with care. Every movement was prescribed, precise and imbued with meaning. The way the host folded the silk cloth to wipe the tea scoop, the way he turned the bowl so its most beautiful side faced the guest, the specific formalized phrases that were exchanged. It was a shared meditation, an oasis of perfect harmonious order in a chaotic world. For a warrior with no war, the tea ceremony became a different kind of battlefield. It was a place to demonstrate his discipline, his aesthetic sensibility, his mastery of self, not with a sword but with a bamboo whisk. It was a way of practicing for a battle of the soul. Following Ri was Makoto, which translates to honesty or sincerity. The samurai's word was his bond. To make a promise was to stake your entire honor on its fulfillment. To lie was one of the most shameful things a samurai could do. The samurai has no need for a written oath. The saying went, his word is sufficient. This created a culture of incredible directness in some ways. A deal could be struck with a handshake and a nod, and it would be as binding as any modern, 100-page contract vetted by a team of lawyers. But again, the ideal ran headfirst into the messy reality of human interaction, especially in a culture that prized social harmony above all else. This led to the development of two concepts that are crucial to understanding Japanese culture even today, tatemae and hone. Tatemae is the public face, the official story, the polite facade that you present to the world to maintain harmony. Hone is your true feeling, your actual opinion, what you really think. A samurai had to become an expert at reading the air, at understanding the unspoken difference between what someone was saying, tatemae, and what they actually meant, hone. Direct confrontation was seen as crude and disruptive. Communication was a subtle dance of inference and intuition, so while a samurai was expected to be honest, this did not mean he was supposed to go around bluntly stating his true feelings all the time. That would be a violation of rei. His sincerity was about being true to his duties and his station. which often meant keeping his personal opinions, his hone, carefully and respectfully hidden behind a mask of polite, agreeable tatame. It was a form of honesty to the social order, rather than to one's own internal monologue. We do this in our modern lives all the time, of course. That email that begins, "Hope you're having a great week," is pure tatame. The hone is just do the thing I asked you to do 3 days ago. The samurai simply elevated it to a high art form. All of these virtues were wrapped up in the overarching concept of meiyo, honor. This is perhaps the most difficult concept for the modern Western mind to truly grasp. For us, honor is often a personal, internal quality. For the samurai, meiyo was an external thing. It was his reputation, his social standing, his good name, and by extension the good name of his entire family, his ancestors, and his lord. It was a form of social currency, more valuable than wealth. Everything he did, every action, every word, either added to his store of honor or diminished it. This is why samurai could seem so incredibly sensitive to insults. A casual remark that we might brush off could be perceived as a direct attack on a samurai's meiyo, and therefore a threat to his very existence. If his honor was publicly damaged, his social standing would collapse. He might lose his position, his stipend. He would bring shame upon his entire family. This created a hair-trigger sensitivity. A duel could be fought over something as trivial as one samurai's scabbard accidentally bumping into another's as they passed in the street. This wasn't because they were all hotheads. It was because these small symbolic acts were seen as tests of one's honor. To let even a minor slight pass without a response was to signal weakness, which could invite further, more serious challenges. His honor was a fragile, precious thing that had to be guarded with constant, vigilant paranoia. And finally, the bedrock upon which the entire structure of Bushido was built, chugi, loyalty. This was the absolute, unwavering, and unconditional devotion of a samurai to his lord, his daimyo. This was not like modern employee loyalty. It was a sacred, almost religious bond. A samurai's life did not belong to him. It belonged to his lord. He was expected to follow his lord's orders without question, even if those orders were to commit acts he found distasteful, or in the most extreme case, to take his own life. This was the ultimate expression of his identity. He was not an individual. He was a vassal, a servant of a higher power. This ideal of absolute loyalty was the glue that held the feudal system together, but it also created profound moral dilemmas. What if your lord was a cruel, incompetent fool? What if he ordered you to do something that violated your own sense of justice? Your jainas. This was the stuff of countless Japanese legends and plays, the loyal retainer forced into an impossible choice between two competing virtues of the Bushido code. In most cases, chugi was expected to trump all else. Loyalty to the lord was the highest law. This meant that a samurai had to subordinate his own conscience, his own sense of right and wrong to the will of his master. It was a demand for a kind of self-abnegation that is almost unthinkable to our modern, individualistic mindset. So with this complex, demanding, and often contradictory code as his guide, what did our young samurai actually do all day? His life was one of routine, of ritual, of quiet, disciplined monotony. He would rise before dawn. His first act might be to practice his swordsmanship, the kata he had learned as a boy, not for a coming battle but as a form of moving meditation, a way to focus his mind and spirit for the day ahead. He would then dress, a ritual in itself, the layers of undergarments, the fine silk kimono, and finally the act of thrusting the daisho through his sash, or obi. The weight of the two swords at his hip was a constant physical reminder of who he was. Then he would go to work, and his work was, for the most part, crushingly, unbelievably boring. The great castles of Japan, during the Tokugawa peace, were not primarily military fortresses. They were administrative centers, the hubs of government for their domain. Our samurai was not a soldier on patrol. He was, in essence, a civil servant, a middle manager in a very well-armed feudal corporation. His job might be in the supply office, meticulously recording bushels of rice coming in and out of the castle storehouses. He might be a scribe, spending his entire day with a brush in his hand, painstakingly copying official documents and decrees. He might be an auditor, traveling to villages to check tax records. He might be a junior official in the Department of Public Works, overseeing bridge repairs. It was a life of ledgers, of reports, of inkstones and abacuses. The most ferocious weapon he wielded on any given day was likely to be his personal seal, his hanko, used to stamp official papers. The social environment of the castle was a silent, passive-aggressive battlefield. He had to be constantly aware of the subtle currents of power, of who was in favour with the daimyo and who was not. A misplaced word, an association with the wrong faction, could stall his career for decades. He learned to speak in careful, non-committal phrases, to keep his face a placid, unreadable mask, to hide his honin so deeply that he sometimes forgot what it was himself. He was fighting a war, but it was a war of whispers, of alliances, of subtle manoeuvring for position and influence. When his duties for the day were done, what then? He couldn't just clock out and go to the pub. His off-duty hours were also governed by the need to cultivate his samurai persona. This is when the arts became so vital. He might spend his afternoon in quiet contemplation in his garden, meticulously raking the patterns in the gravel of a Zen rock garden, a physical act designed to produce mental calm. He might practice his calligraphy, not for official documents but for the pure aesthetic pleasure of creating a single perfect character. He might try his hand at poetry, composing a 17-syllable haiku that captured a fleeting moment of natural beauty. These were not just hobbies, they were essential survival mechanisms. They were a way for him to practice the discipline, focus and self-mastery his warrior training had given him, but to apply it to peaceful, creative ends. In a world that denied him the chance to be a warrior in practice, the arts allowed him to remain a warrior in spirit. It was his private battle against the slow, creeping poison of irrelevance. His home life was similarly formal and prescribed. Marriages were not based on love or romantic attraction. They were strategic alliances between families, arranged by parents or go-betweens. His wife, also from a samurai family, was expected to be a model of stoicism and domestic management. She would run the household with quiet efficiency, managing the often strained finances and overseeing the education of the children. The relationship between husband and wife was often one of respectful distance rather than warm intimacy. Affection was shown not through grand romantic gestures, but through the flawless performance of one's duties to the family and the household. Of course, not all samurai lived up to this lofty ideal. The human spirit being what it is, many chafed under the rigid constraints of their lives. Beneath the placid surface of Tokugawa society, there was a thriving underbelly. Some samurai, consumed by boredom and a lack of purpose, fell into gambling and heavy drinking. They would frequent the floating world, the licensed pleasure districts of the major cities, seeking a temporary escape in the company of courtesans and entertainers. Some fell deep into debt with the rising merchant class, a source of immense shame for a warrior who was supposed to be above such worldly concerns. And for those who seriously transgressed, or whose lords were dispossessed, there was the ultimate nightmare, to become a ronin, a masterless samurai. A ronin was a man adrift, a wave man, belonging nowhere. He was a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale, a warrior with no one to be loyal to, the most terrifying state of non-existence a samurai could imagine. As you lie there now, letting the world outside your window fade away, picture our samurai at the end of a long, typical day. He is sitting on the veranda of his home, the polished wood cool beneath him. The sun has set. The only sounds are the rhythmic chirping of crickets in his small garden, and the faint distant sound of a bamboo flute. He has spent his day checking rice inventories, bowing to his superiors, and carefully composing a report. He has not drawn his sword. He has not faced a single moment of physical danger. He is safe. He is secure. And he is, perhaps, profoundly unfulfilled. He looks at the two swords resting on a polished stand inside his room. They are the symbols of his identity, the culmination of his entire life's training. They are things of exquisite, deadly beauty, and they are, for him, almost entirely useless. The great battle he was forged for never came. His life is a long, slow anticlimax, and so he finds his purpose not in grand deeds but in small, perfect moments. The way he sips his evening tea, the composition of a poem about the moon, the quiet resolve to face another identical day tomorrow with the same unwavering discipline and grace as he would have faced a horde of enemy soldiers. The real way of the warrior, for him, was the struggle to keep a warrior's soul alive in the quiet, peaceful heart of a bureaucrat's world. His true battle was the long, slow, silent war against the mundane. One perfectly copied document, one flawlessly executed tea ceremony, one silent, resolute breath at a time. Chapter 3. The Steel and the Silk, Armor, Weapons, and the Katana's Soul. Now that our samurai has been forged into a man, and has settled into the often quiet rhythm of a life of peace, let's turn our attention to the physical objects that defined him, because to understand the samurai, you have to understand his tools, and these were not just tools, they were an extension of his body, a statement of his status, and in the case of his sword, the very repository of his soul. We're going to embark on a slow, detailed, sensory journey into the world of steel and silk, of lacquer and leather. We're going to feel the immense weight of his armor, understand the almost mystical reverence for his blade, and appreciate the deadly pragmatism of the other weapons in his arsenal. So find that comfortable position, let your shoulders relax, and allow your breathing to become slow and deep. We're going to leave the world of bureaucracy and politics behind, and enter the quiet, focused world of the craftsman, the armorer, and the swordsmith. Let's explore the physical reality of being a warrior. We have to begin with the armor. The iconic image of the samurai is often one of sleek, agile movement. We see it in movies, a warrior, seemingly unencumbered, leaping and spinning in a fluid dance of death. The reality, as is so often the case, was something quite different. The classic suit of samurai armor, the oyoroi or great harness, was less of a sleek uniform and more of a personal, wearable fortress. It was heavy, it was cumbersome, and it was a masterpiece of both engineering and art. If you think wearing a heavy winter coat all day is a bit much, the samurai would have found your complaint quite charming. Let's start with what it was made of. The core components were not large, solid plates of steel like a European knight's armor. That kind of construction wouldn't work well with the preferred fighting style of the samurai, which involved more agility and the use of the bow from horseback. Instead, the armor was made from thousands of tiny individual scales or plates, called kozani. These could be made of iron or hardened leather. Each tiny scale was coated in lacquer, a natural resin from a tree, to protect it from the relentless humidity of the Japanese climate and the ever-present threat of rust. Then these thousands of lacquered scales were painstakingly laced together with brightly colored silk or leather cords. Imagine the sheer man-hours involved. An armorer would sit for months, patiently threading these cords, creating strong but flexible panels. The result was a kind of fabric of armor, a textile of steel and silk. The colors of the lacing, the odoshi, were not random. They were often specific to a particular clan or family, a way of identifying friend from foe in the chaotic scrum of a battlefield. It was a uniform, a national flag, and a protective shell, all in one. Now, let's get our samurai dressed. The process of putting on a full suit of armor was a ritual. It was not something you could do alone in a hurry. It was, what a modern observer might politely call, a team effort, requiring the help of at least one attendant. First came the undergarments, a soft silk or cotton kimono-like garment called a hitatari. Then, over his legs, he would pull on the suniate or greaves, which protected his shins. These were often curved plates of iron hinged together. Next came the haidate, a kind of armoured apron that covered his thighs, followed by the kote, the armoured sleeves that protected his arms and hands. These were not simple tubes of metal. They were fabric sleeves onto which plates of iron were sewn, allowing for flexibility at the elbow and wrist. So far, he's already wearing a significant amount of weight, and the main event hasn't even started. The centerpiece was the do, the cuirass that protected his torso. This was a heavy, box-like construction that wrapped around his body. To this were attached the large rectangular shoulder guards, the osode. These were not attached to the arms themselves, but to the cuirass, hanging like great protective shields over his upper arms. They were essential for deflecting arrows, but they also significantly restricted his ability to raise his arms directly above his head. Finally, after this entire construction was assembled on his body and tied securely with a dizzying array of knots and cords, came the most iconic piece, the helmet, or kabuto, and this was no simple metal pot. The kabuto was the crown jewel of the armor, a statement of power and personality. It was a heavy iron bowl, often made of dozens of individual plates riveted together, with a flaring neck guard at the back, but it was the front that was designed for pure psychological impact. Attached to the helmet was the menyo, a face mask. These were often demonic or ferocious in appearance, with snarling mouths, bristling moustaches made of horsehair, and sometimes even fangs. This wasn't just for protection, it was theatre. It was designed to dehumanize the samurai, to transform him from a man into a terrifying apparition, a demon on the battlefield, striking fear into his enemies before a single blow was struck. And to top it all off, there was the crest, the Meidut. This could be anything from a simple sun disk to elaborate gilded carvings of dragons, stags, or other mythological creatures. It was his personal banner, an unmistakable silhouette against the sky. So now, he's dressed, he is encased, and we need to talk about what that actually felt like. The first and most overwhelming sensation was the weight. A full suit of oyoroi could weigh upwards of 60 pounds, or nearly 30 kilograms, and this wasn't weight distributed evenly, like in a modern hiking backpack. It was a dead, relentless weight pressing down on his shoulders, his hips, his legs. Every single movement required a conscious effort. Just to stand up from a kneeling position was a full-body workout. Then there was the sound. A samurai in full armor was not a stealthy creature. He was a walking percussion instrument. Every step was accompanied by a complex symphony of noises, the soft clatter of the thousands of scales against each other, the creak of the leather bindings, the jingle of the metal fittings. In a silent room, it would have been deafening. On a battlefield, the sound of 10,000 armored samurai on the move must have been like a terrifying rolling tide of thunder. And the smell. The armor had its own unique, pungent aroma. It was a mixture of the sharp, chemical tang of the lacquer, the earthy scent of the leather, and the faint, musty smell of the silk. And once he started to exert himself, that was mixed with the hot, coppery smell of his own sweat, trapped inside the layers of fabric and steel. After a long day of campaigning, the armor would have been a profoundly unpleasant thing to be near. And his senses were muted. Inside the helmet, with the face mask tied on, his world became a claustrophobic box. His vision was restricted to a narrow slit for his eyes. His peripheral vision was non-existent. He had to turn his entire head, armor and all, just to look to the side. His hearing was muffled by the layers of steel and silk. He would have felt strangely disconnected from the world, hearing the shouts of battle as if from a great distance. And the heat. On a hot summer day, the armor became a personal oven. The dark lacquer would absorb the sun's rays, and with little to no ventilation, the samurai was essentially being slow-cooked in his own private sauna. Heat stroke was as much an enemy as any opposing soldier. To wear the armor was to enter into an adversarial relationship with your own equipment. It was a constant battle against weight, heat, and sensory deprivation. It required a level of physical conditioning and mental endurance that is hard for us to imagine. It was a cage of silk and steel, but it was also a sanctuary. Inside that cage he was protected. He was powerful. He was transformed from a man of flesh and blood into a living icon, a terrifying and beautiful engine of war. Now let's move from the defensive shell to the offensive core, from the body to the soul. We must talk about the swords. The daisho, the pairing of the long sword, the katana, and the short sword, the wakizashi, was more than just a set of weapons. It was the exclusive privilege of the samurai class, a badge of rank so potent that it was often referred to simply as the soul of the samurai. To touch another samurai's sword without permission was a grave insult, often punishable by death. There was an entire complex etiquette surrounding them: how to wear them, how to pass them to an attendant, how to place them on a rack when entering a home. These were sacred objects, and the reason for this reverence lies in the way they were made. The creation of a katana was not an industrial process. It was a religious ceremony, a mystical act of alchemy. The swordsmith, the kaji, was not seen as a simple blacksmith. He was an artist and a priest, a master of secrets passed down through generations. Before beginning his work, he would undergo purification rituals. He would dress in white priestly robes and hang sacred Shinto ropes, the shimanawa, around his forge to ward off evil spirits. and create a consecrated space. The process began with the steel itself. Traditional Japanese swords were not made from uniform bars of industrial steel. They were made from a unique smelted steel called tamahagane, or jewel steel. This was produced in a massive clay furnace, a tartara, in a multi-day process of heating iron sand with charcoal. The result was a bloom of steel that was highly inconsistent, with some parts being very high in carbon, making them extremely hard but brittle, and other parts being low in carbon, making them softer but much tougher and more ductile. A lesser craftsman would see this as a flaw. The genius of the Japanese swordsmith was to turn this inconsistency into the sword's greatest strength. The smith would take these different pieces of tamahagane, heat them in his charcoal forge until they glowed a bright orange yellow, and then hammer them out into flat bars. Then came the most famous part of the process, the folding. He would hammer a high carbon bar flat, score it down the middle, and fold it back on itself. Then he would hammer it flat again. Heat, hammer, fold, heat, hammer, fold, over and over and over again. With each fold, the number of layers in the steel doubled. After 10 folds, there were over 1,000 layers. After 15, over 30,000. This process did two things. It hammered out impurities in the metal, and it distributed the carbon with incredible evenness, creating a homogeneous, yet intricately layered block of steel. But a sword made only of this hard steel would be too brittle. It might shatter on impact, so the smith would also forge a core of softer, low-carbon steel. The final blade was a composite, a brilliant piece of engineering. The smith would wrap the hard, high-carbon steel, which would become the cutting edge and the sides of the blade, around the softer, shock-absorbing core. It was the perfect marriage of properties. A razor-sharp, incredibly hard edge, supported by a tough, resilient spine that could withstand the enormous stresses of combat. It was, in essence, a surgical scalpel wrapped around a crowbar. The final, most critical, and most magical step was the heat treatment, the quenching. This was the moment that gave the sword its distinctive curve and its hardened edge. The smith would coat the blade in a secret mixture of clay, charcoal powder, and other ingredients. He would apply a thick layer along the spine and a very thin layer along the edge. Then he would heat the blade one last time, in the dark of the forge, judging the temperature by color alone, waiting for it to reach the precise shade of the rising sun. At the perfect moment, he would plunge the blade, edge first, into a trough of water. The sound was a violent hiss. The sudden extreme cooling caused the steel to transform its molecular structure. The thinly coated edge cooled much faster than the thickly coated spine, becoming incredibly hard. The spine cooled more slowly, remaining softer and tougher. This differential cooling also caused the blade to curve naturally, elegantly, upwards. This was the birth of the sword, a moment of such high tension that a tiny mistake in timing or temperature could cause the blade to crack, wasting months of painstaking work. But if it was successful, the result was a thing of wonder. The clay mixture would be scraped away to reveal the hamon, the temper line. This was the visible boundary between the hard-edged steel and the softer spine steel, a beautiful wavy cloud-like pattern that was the unique signature of the smith. It was not just a byproduct of the process, it was a work of art in itself. The smith's work was now done, but the sword was far from finished. It was handed over to a succession of other master craftsmen. First, the polisher, the togishi. This was another highly specialized art. Using a series of progressively finer waterstones, the polisher would spend weeks, sometimes months, painstakingly rubbing the blade, revealing its inner beauty. He would bring out the subtle wood-grain-like pattern in the steel, the jihada, which was a result of the folding process, and he would give the hamon its milky white ethereal appearance. It was the polisher who transformed the blade from a dull, fire-scaled piece of metal into a gleaming work of art. Then came the artisans who would create the fittings, the koshirai. A specialist would craft the wooden scabbard, the saya, lacquering it with dozens of thin layers to a mirror-like finish. Another would carve the hilt and cover it in the rough, pebbly skin of a stingray, the same gawa, which provided a superb non-slip grip. Yet another would wrap the hilt in intricate patterns of silk or leather cord. The suka ito, the hand guard, the suba, was a work of art in itself. a small disc of metal, often decorated with exquisite carvings of natural scenes, animals, or mythological figures. Every single component was created by a master of his craft. A single sword was the collaborative product of a half-dozen different artists, all working at the highest level of their skill. This is why the sword was the samurai's soul. It was born of earth, fire, water, and air. It was the product of immense, patient, and spiritually infused labor. It was both a peerless weapon and a transcendent work of art. To hold one, to feel its perfect balance, to see the way the light plays across its polished surfaces, is to understand why it was revered. Of course, the katana was the star of the show, but it did not travel alone. The wakizashi, its shorter companion, was just as important. It was forged and mounted with the same care. Its purpose was multifold. In the tight confines of a building or a narrow alley, the long katana could be clumsy and difficult to draw. The shorter wakizashi was the ideal close-quarters weapon. It was also the sword that a samurai would keep with him when he entered a private home. As a matter of etiquette, he would leave his katana with an attendant or on a rack at the entrance, but he would keep his wakizashi at his side as a weapon of personal defense. It was his backup, his last resort, and in the darkest of circumstances, it was the blade used for the ritual suicide of Seppuku, a topic we will explore later. But for all the glory and romance of the sword, we must be pragmatic. On a true large-scale medieval battlefield, the sword was almost always a secondary weapon. The real work, the unglamorous, brutal, and effective work of winning battles, was done by two other weapons, the spear and the bow. The spear, the yari, was the true king of the battlefield. What it lacked in elegance, it more than made up for in sheer, brutal efficiency. Spears were cheaper and faster to produce than swords, meaning entire armies could be equipped with them. And in the hands of a disciplined unit of foot soldiers, a wall of spear points was an almost impenetrable defense against a cavalry charge. The samurai, for all his mounted prowess, had to respect the reach of the spear. He trained extensively in its use. The art of sojutsu, he learned to use its length to keep his enemies at a distance, the power of a two-handed thrust, the sweeping motions used to clear a path. While the katana might be used for heroic one-on-one duels, the spear was the weapon of the rank and file, the weapon that decided the fate of armies. And then there was the bow, the yumi. As we've touched on before, the Japanese longbow was a unique and formidable weapon. Its asymmetrical design was a work of genius, made from laminated layers of bamboo and wood. It was incredibly powerful and had a long range. The original samurai ideal was not the swordsman, but the mounted archer, the Kyuba no Michi, or the way of the horse and bow. For centuries, the pinnacle of samurai skill was the ability to fire accurately from a galloping horse. The sound of a flight of arrows was called the Devil's Whisper, a terrifying sound that preceded a deadly storm of steel-tipped shafts. Even in the Age of Peace, the practice of archery, kaido, was considered a profound spiritual discipline, a way of cultivating focus, stillness, and perfect form. But there was another weapon, a foreign import, that would arrive in the 16th century and change the face of Japanese warfare forever. It was the matchlock musket, the Tanegashima. When the first Portuguese traders arrived, they brought with them these noisy, smoky, and seemingly crude firearms. The samurai were initially disdainful of them. They were slow to load, wildly inaccurate compared to a bow, and useless in the rain. And more importantly, they required no skill. A peasant could be taught to use a musket in a few days, and from a distance kill the most highly trained samurai master who had dedicated his entire life to the martial arts. It seemed like a coward's weapon, but some of the more pragmatic daimyo saw their potential. They began to produce them in huge numbers, and they discovered that while one musket was inaccurate, a volley of 500 muskets fired at once was devastatingly effective against a charging army. The gun was impersonal, it was loud, it was ugly, it had none of the artistry of the sword or the spiritual depth of the bow, but it worked. The introduction of the firearm marked the beginning of the end for the classical form of samurai warfare. It was a democratic weapon, a leveler of the battlefield, and a profound threat to the warrior ethos that was built on individual skill and courage. As you rest here, in the quiet of your room, try to picture these objects not as museum pieces behind glass, but as living things. Feel the oppressive weight of the armor on your shoulders. Imagine the cool, rough texture of the ray skin on the hilt of a katana in your hand. Hear the whisper of the silk cords as the sword is drawn from its lacquered scabbard. Hear the sharp, resonant twang of a bowstring. The sarune, a sound considered so beautiful it was admired in its own right. These were the things that populated the samurai's world. They were at once tools of incredible violence and objects of breathtaking beauty. They were the physical embodiment of a philosophy that sought to find a perfect, deadly harmony between the practical and the poetic, a silent testament to the hands that made them, the hands that held them, and the unbending will they were sworn to serve. Chapter 4. Theatre of War. The Samurai on the Battlefield. So far we have built a samurai from the ground up, forging his mind and body in the crucible of a relentless education. We have then placed this perfect warrior into a world of profound and often frustrating peace, where his greatest battles were fought against boredom and the subtle intrigues of a bureaucratic court. He has his armor, a beautiful and cumbersome shell. He has his swords, the venerated soul of his class. He is a predator, with no prey, a finely tuned instrument waiting for a song that is rarely played. But now we are going to change that. Let the quiet of the dojo and the tea room fade. We are going to explore the very purpose for which our samurai was created. We are going to take him to war. But this won't be a grand, sweeping story of a single famous battle. Instead, we're going to immerse ourselves in the gritty, exhausting, and often terrifying reality of what it actually meant to be a samurai on campaign. We're going to examine the entire process, from the moment the call to arms arrives, to the grueling march, to the chaotic and brutal theatre of the battlefield itself. This is the world that existed beneath the polished veneer of Bushido, a world of mud, blood, and profound endurance. So as you settle in, let the sounds of your own world begin to recede. Allow yourself to sink a little deeper into your bed. We are about to step into a time of chaos, but we will do it together, from a safe and comfortable distance. Let's join our samurai as he hears the news that will change everything. The long peace is over. It is time to go to war. It begins not with a thunderous declaration, but with a quiet, urgent message. A runner, his legs caked in dust and his chest heaving, arrives at the castle gates bearing a scroll sealed with the daimyo's crest. The message is passed from hand to hand, up the chain of command, its contents whispered in hushed, serious tones in the corridors of power. The summons has come. A rival clan has made a move. A border has been disputed. An old alliance has fractured. The reasons are, in a way, irrelevant to our samurai. His lord has called, and he must answer. The complex web of obligations that has defined his entire life has just been pulled taut. For our samurai, who may have spent years, even decades, in the peaceful routine of administrative duty, this news is a jolt, a lightning strike in a calm sky. The feeling is a complex cocktail of emotions. There is, of course, a sense of grave duty. This is the moment his entire existence has been a rehearsal for. But beneath that, there is likely a flicker of something else. A grim excitement, a sense of release. The long, slow war against irrelevance is over. The swords at his hip are no longer just symbols. The armor in its lacquered box is no longer just an heirloom. They are about to become tools. He is about to become what he was always meant to be. This is his purpose, finally made real. But before he can march off to glory, there is the immense and decidedly unglamorous task of preparation. War, he knows, is not just about courage and swordplay. It is about logistics. It is about preparation. And the process of a samurai preparing for war was a meticulous, ritualized affair. Think of it as the most stressful and high-stakes packing job in human history. First, his armor must be made ready. It would be taken from its ornate storage box, piece by piece, and laid out for inspection. For years it may have been an object of quiet pride, something to be aired out on sunny days to prevent mildew. Now it is viewed with a new, critical eye. Every silk cord is checked for fraying. A single broken lace could mean a plate comes loose at a critical moment, creating a fatal vulnerability. Every metal scale is examined for rust. Every rivet is tested for strength. His attendants would work for hours, sometimes days, making minor repairs, replacing worn leather straps, relacing sections with fresh, strong silk. The armor is being reawakened, transformed from a museum piece back into a functional piece of life-saving equipment. Then comes the matter of his weapons. His spears would be brought out, the wooden shafts checked for splinters or cracks. The steel heads would be sharpened to a vicious point. His bow would be unstrung and inspected, the bamboo and wood checked for any sign of weakness or warping. He would select his arrows with care, ensuring the fletchings were intact and the heads were secure. There were different types of arrowheads for different purposes. Some were wide and leaf-shaped for cutting. Others were narrow, heavy and pointed, designed specifically to punch through armor. Choosing his quiver was like a grim form of accounting, calculating the different kinds of death he intended to deal. And of course there were his swords. They would be brought to a polisher for a final perfect edge. The hilt wrappings would be checked to ensure they were tight and provided a secure grip. He would practice drawing the katana from its scabbard over and over, reacquainting his muscles with the familiar weight and motion, ensuring the draw was perfectly smooth, with no hint of sticking or friction. But the preparations were not just military. He had to prepare his household for his absence, which could last for months, or, as he was keenly aware, forever. He would meet with his wife and the senior retainers of his household, giving instructions for managing the family's affairs. He would ensure the finances were in order, that the rice stipends were secure. This was all done with a calm, stoic demeanor. There were no dramatic, tearful farewells as we might imagine. The samurai code demanded emotional restraint. His duty was to go to war, and his family's duty was to endure his absence with the same quiet fortitude. The farewell would be a formal, respectful bow. 1,000 unspoken things would hang in the air between him and his wife, a lifetime of shared experience communicated in a single silent glance. Then came the personal, almost spiritual preparations. He would spend time in quiet meditation, attempting to calm his mind and achieve a state of readiness, of acceptance of whatever was to come. He might compose a death poem, a short, poignant verse capturing a final thought or feeling. This was not seen as morbid. It was a way of confronting his own mortality head-on, of making peace with the possibility of death before he ever set foot on the battlefield. It was the ultimate act of mental preparation, the medieval equivalent of putting one's affairs in order. He was trying to untether himself from the fear of dying, so that he could function without hesitation when the time came. Finally, there was the packing of his personal kit. Every samurai was accompanied on campaign by one or more attendants, or chugen, commoners who served as his baggage carriers and general helpers. But what did he actually bring? It was a surprisingly practical list. A change of clothes, spare straw sandals, or waraji, because the ones he wore would fall apart with astonishing speed on a long march. A small sewing kit for repairs, a whetstone for sharpening his blades, a small amount of polished rice, and perhaps some preserved food like pickled plums or dried fish. There would be a simple bowl and chopsticks, and perhaps a small scroll of his favorite text, a work of strategy or philosophy, for quiet moments in camp. It was the kit of a man who expected to face both mortal combat and long stretches of tedious, uncomfortable travel. Forget your noise-cancelling headphones and your travel pillow. The luxury items on this trip were a dry pair of sandals and a handful of rice that wasn't full of weevils. When the day of departure comes, he is a transformed figure. He dons his armor in a final solemn ritual. As the last knot is tied and the demonic face mask is lowered into place, he ceases to be the man his family knows. He is now an instrument of his Lord's will. He mounts his horse, a creature as finely bred and trained as he is, and joins the growing river of soldiers flowing out from the castle town. The journey to the battlefield has begun. And we must understand that the march, the shusi, was often a greater ordeal than the battle itself. Battles, even major ones, were often over in a matter of hours. The march to get there could take weeks, even months, of relentless soul-crushing toil. The image of a grand, orderly army marching in perfect formation is largely a fantasy. The reality was a slow, chaotic, sprawling procession, a mobile city of thousands of men and horses, inching its way across the landscape. The first enemy the samurai faced was not a rival clan. It was the terrain. The roads of feudal Japan were not paved highways. They were narrow, often muddy tracks that wound their way through mountains and across rivers. A single broken-down supply cart could bring a column of thousands of men to a grinding halt for hours. When it rained, these tracks turned into glutinous quagmires of mud that sucked at the feet of men and horses, making every single step an act of exhausting effort. Our samurai, even on horseback, was not immune. The sheer boredom and frustration of this slow, stop-and-start progress was a test of his mental endurance. And then there was the sheer physical discomfort. He might be on horseback, but the foot soldiers, the ashigaru, who made up the bulk of the army, were walking 10, 15, 20 miles a day, every day, carrying their own weapons and a portion of their supplies. The straw sandals would disintegrate in the mud and on the rocky paths. Blisters would form, bleed, and become infected. Sickness would sweep through the ranks. Dysentery, from contaminated water sources, could cripple an army more effectively than any enemy force. The logistics of feeding this moving city were a nightmare. The army had to carry some of its own food, but for a long campaign this was impossible. They had to rely on pre-arranged supply depots, or, more often, on foraging, which was a polite term for taking what they needed from the local peasantry. An army passing through a region was like a swarm of locusts, stripping the fields and emptying the storehouses. For the common people, the arrival of a friendly army was often just as terrifying as the arrival of an enemy one. Our samurai, as an officer of rank, would be insulated from the worst of this. He would have his attendants to make his camp and prepare his food, but he could not escape the sensory reality of the march. The sound was a constant low roar, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet, the creak and groan of armor, the jingle of harnesses, the rumble of cartwheels, the shouts of officers, and the low murmur of countless conversations. It was a river of noise that flowed with the army. And the smell. It would have been overwhelming. The smell of wood smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the smell of horses and their dung, the smell of sweat from thousands of unwashed bodies marching under a hot sun, the smell of mud and wet wool, and the ever-present acrid smell of the latrine trenches that were dug at every camp. It was a thick, organic soup of an aroma, the signature scent of a pre-modern army on the move. Along the way, the army's eyes and ears were its scouts. These could be samurai on fast horses, but often this work fell to specialists in stealth and intelligence gathering, the figures we have come to know as ninja, or, more properly, shinobi. These agents would move ahead of the army, often in disguise as traveling monks or merchants, mapping the terrain, assessing the enemy's strength and position, and engaging in acts of sabotage. The information they brought back was critical. A campaign could be won or lost based on the quality of a single scout's report. After days or weeks of this grueling travel, the army finally arrives in the vicinity of the enemy. They make camp, and it is here, in the final hours before a battle, that the psychological pressure reaches its peak. The camp is a hive of controlled, nervous energy. The noise of the march gives way to a different soundscape. The sharp, rhythmic tink-tink-tink of armourers making last-minute repairs, the whirring sound of whetstones on blades, the low murmur of men talking in small groups, their voices tight with anticipation. Our samurai would use this time for his final preparations. He would oversee the care of his horse, ensuring it was fed and watered. He would check his armour and weapons one last time, a familiar meditative ritual. He would attend a final war council with his commanders, studying crude maps drawn in the dirt, listening to the battle plan. His role in the coming fight would be explained to him. He was a cog in a great machine, and he needed to know his part perfectly. As night falls, a strange quiet descends. Fear, which had been a low hum in the background, now becomes a palpable presence. It's a cold fog that settles over the camp, a knot in the stomach of every soldier, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest spearman. How a samurai dealt with this fear was the ultimate test of his training. He was not expected to be fearless. He was expected to master his fear. He would retreat into himself, perhaps practicing his breathing, reciting a Buddhist sutra, or simply sitting in silent meditation. He was trying to find that still, immovable point in his mind, the Fudoshin, while his heart hammered against his ribs. He would eat a final meal, a simple affair of rice and soup. It was a meal that was politely called functional. He would know, as every man in the camp knew, that for many of them this would be their last. He might take out a brush and inkstone and write a final letter home, to be delivered by his attendant should he fall. He was not just a warrior, he was a son, a husband, a father, and in these last quiet hours, the weight of those connections would feel incredibly heavy. He was fighting not just for his lord, but for the honor and survival of his own house. He might not sleep at all, his mind racing. He would lie on his simple straw mat, listening to the sounds of the camp, a cough from a nearby tent, the nicker of a horse, the lonely call of a sentry. He would be acutely aware of every sensation, the feel of the rough blanket, the chill in the night air. It is in this long, dark night of the soul that the boy is truly separated from the man. And then, before the sky has even begun to lighten, the call comes. The sound of a deep, resonant boom from a war drum, the taiko, or the piercing blast of a conch shell trumpet, the horror guy. It's a mournful alien sound, a sound that cuts through the dark and signals that the waiting is over, the day of battle has dawned. The camp erupts into a flurry of disciplined activity. The final pieces of armor are strapped on, the swords are thrust through the sash, a final hurried meal of rice is eaten, and then the army begins to move into position, a great clanking beast stirring from its slumber. As the sun rises, our samurai would see the battlefield for the first time, and it would be a spectacle of terrifying beauty. Across the field, the enemy army would be doing the same, deploying into their formations. The morning light would glint off thousands of spear points, off the lacquered scales of armor, and above it all, a forest of banners. Each clan, each unit, had its own flags and banners. The sashimono worn on the back of each soldier, the great waving nobori that marked the command posts. The field would be a riot of color and iconography, clan crests, powerful calligraphy, images of gods and dragons. It was the world's most dangerous pre-game show, a spectacular display of power and pride before the bloodshed began. Our samurai would find his position in the formation. He would be surrounded by the men of his own unit, familiar faces now hidden behind demonic masks. He would see his own lord's banner, a rallying point, a source of courage. The commanders would ride along the lines, shouting words of encouragement. The air would be thick with a tension so palpable it was almost hard to breathe. Then, the battle begins. And it rarely begins with a heroic, glorious charge. It begins with a contest of ranged weapons. The first sound is the deep, shuddering thrum of thousands of bowstrings being released at once, followed a moment later by a sound like tearing silk as a storm of arrows flies through the air. Our samurai would raise his large shoulder guard, the osode, or duck behind a large standing wooden shield, listening to the deadly hiss of the arrows passing overhead, and the sickening thump and cries of men who were not so lucky. Then, a new sound would join the symphony, a deafening, rolling crack, like 1,000 doors being slammed at once, followed by a thick cloud of acrid grey-black smoke that stings the eyes and throat. The Ashigaru musketeers, the Tep, have unleashed their first volley. The air is filled with the whine of lead balls. This is the new face of war, impersonal and brutally effective. The samurai, for all his skill and armor, is just as vulnerable to a musket ball as the rawest peasant recruit. After these opening salvos, which could go on for some time, the real battle would be joined. The war drums would beat a new, faster rhythm. The conch shells would sound the order to advance, and with a great guttural roar that is part fear, part fury, the two armies would begin to move towards each other, first at a walk, then a trot, then a full, ground-shaking charge. This is the moment of truth. Our samurai, on his horse, would be part of this wave of steel and humanity. The experience would be a chaotic sensory overload, the roar of thousands of men screaming their war cries, the thunder of hooves, the sight of the enemy line growing closer and closer, a terrifying wall of spear points and demonic masks. Forget the elegant, choreographed battles of the movies. A medieval battlefield was a clumsy, desperate shoving match with very sharp objects. It was a chaotic, swirling melee, the human meat grinder. The primary weapon here was the spear. The front lines would crash together with a horrific crunch of metal on metal, of wood on bone. The goal was to break the enemy's formation, to create a gap that could be exploited. Our samurai on horseback would be trying to do just that. using the weight and power of his mount to punch through the enemy lines. He would be a target for every enemy spearman and archer if he was unhorsed, or if he chose to dismount, he would finally draw his katana. And it is here, in the heart of the scrum, that his lifetime of training would be put to the ultimate test. His mind would need to be in a state of mushin, no mind. There is no time for thought, only for reaction. The katana he practiced thousands of times must now flow from him instinctively. Block, parry, cut. The movements must be economical and precise. A single wasted motion, a moment of hesitation, would mean death. The fighting was brutal and intimate. He would see the eyes of his opponent, feel the spray of blood, smell the hot coppery scent of it. He would hear the screams of the wounded and the dying, a sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The ground beneath his feet would become a treacherous soup of mud and blood, littered with abandoned weapons, fallen banners, and the bodies of the dead and dying. It was not a place of honor and glory. It was a vision of hell on earth. Amidst this chaos, a strange ritual might still play out. Two samurai of high rank might spot each other on the field. They might, for a moment, separate themselves from the general melee for a one-on-one duel. But even this was not a silent affair. They would begin by shouting their names, their lineage, and a list of their great deeds. It was a formal challenge, a combination of a job interview and a death threat, bellowed over the roar of battle. Only then would they engage, their swords flashing in a deadly personal contest. The winner would often take the head of the vanquished as a trophy, a proof of his victory. This grim practice, the taking of heads, was a central part of samurai warfare. A samurai's worth was measured by the rank of the enemies he defeated. After the battle, there would be a formal ceremony, the head viewing. The heads of defeated enemies would be cleaned, their hair carefully arranged, and they would be presented to the victorious daimyo for inspection. It was a grotesque form of accounting, a performance review where the key metric was decapitation. For our samurai, taking the head of a worthy opponent was the surest way to gain honor, land, and promotion. As the hours wear on, exhaustion becomes as deadly an enemy as any soldier. The sheer physical effort of fighting in 60 pounds of armor is immense. His muscles would scream in protest. His mouth would be dry with thirst. But he could not stop. He could not show weakness. To falter was to die. The battle would often turn on which side broke first, which army's collective will to fight finally shattered, leading to a rout. And when the rout began, the battle entered its most brutal phase. The victors would pursue the fleeing enemy, cutting them down from behind without mercy. There was little concept of taking prisoners, especially for common soldiers. The pursuit was a slaughter. Finally, as the sun begins to set on the blood-soaked field, a quiet falls. The roar of battle is replaced by a sound that is somehow worse, the moaning of the thousands of wounded men scattered across the landscape. The fighting is over, but the dying has just begun. Battlefield medicine was a charming blend of optimism and amputation. Wounds would be washed with whatever water was available, perhaps packed with herbs, and then bandaged, but infection was almost inevitable. For many, a wound that was not immediately fatal was simply a slower, more agonizing death sentence. Our samurai, if he has survived, is a creature beyond exhaustion. His armor is dented, his clothes are soaked in sweat and blood, his body aches with a bone-deep weariness, but it is the psychological toll that is the heaviest. He has witnessed and participated in a level of carnage that would shatter a modern mind. He has seen friends fall, and he has taken lives. He has waded through a river of death. As he sits in the now quiet camp, tending to his wounds and cleaning his blades, he is a changed man. The abstract concepts of honor, glory, and duty have been burned away in the fire of combat, leaving only the hard, cold reality of what he has done. The theatre of war, for all its spectacular banners and proud traditions, is in the end a place of profound and terrible suffering. He has performed his function, he has served his lord, he has survived, but a part of him will remain forever on that field, amidst the silence, the smoke, and the ghosts of the fallen. One perfect form, one desperate lunge, one final silent bar to the inevitable. Chapter 5. The Final Duty. Seppuku and the Concept of an Honorable End. We have followed our samurai through the crucible of his training and the long, quiet test of a life at peace. We have marched with him into the chaotic and brutal theatre of war. He has proven his courage, served his lord, and survived. But in the world of the samurai, there was an outcome that was considered far worse than death on the battlefield. That was failure, and for a samurai who had failed in his duty, who had brought shame upon his name, or who found himself in an untenable position, there was a final, chillingly formal path available. It was a way to wrest control from the hands of fate, to turn a moment of ultimate defeat into a final, spectacular act of will. We are going to talk about seppuku. This is a heavy topic, so let's approach it gently. As you find your most comfortable resting position, let the noise and the light of your room fade into the background. We are not here to dwell on the gruesome, but to understand the philosophy behind a practice that can seem utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. It is a story not of death, but of a particular and profound conception of honor. Let's explore, with a calm and respectful curiosity, the final duty of the samurai. The word most of us know is harakiri. It is a stark, visceral word. It literally means belly cutting. It's the term that focuses on the physical act itself, but the samurai themselves rarely used it. It was considered a bit too direct, a bit crude. They preferred the more formal, more elegant term, seppuku. It uses the same two Chinese characters as harakiri, but in the reverse order, and with a more scholarly, Sino-Japanese pronunciation. The difference is subtle, but it's everything. Harakiri is what happened. Seppuku was the ritual, the ceremony, the philosophy behind it. It was the difference between a bloody act and a profound statement. So why? Why would a culture develop such a specific, painful, and elaborate method of ritual suicide? To understand seppuku, we have to go back to the core of the samurai worldview. We have to understand their concept of honor, or meo. As we've seen, honor was not an internal feeling of self-worth. It was an external, social commodity. It was a samurai's reputation, his public face. To lose honor, to be shamed, was a kind of social death. It was to become a non-person. In a society so rigidly structured, to lose your place was to lose everything. Seppuku, then, was a radical, almost theatrical way to respond to this social death. It was a way of saying, I may have failed, I may be defeated, but I am still in control. I will choose the time and manner of my own end. I will not allow myself to be captured and executed by my enemies. I will not live with this shame. I will die as a samurai, by my own hand. It was the ultimate assertion of individual will in a culture that otherwise demanded absolute conformity and obedience. There was also a deep, almost mystical belief about where the human spirit, the kibi or life force, resided. It was believed to be centered in the hara, the abdomen, the gut. This is a concept that still echoes in Japanese culture. To have hara is to be patient and determined. To be black-hearted is haraguroi. To speak frankly, from the heart, is harawata. So to cut open the abdomen was a symbolic act of incredible power. It was a way of physically opening the seat of one's soul, of showing the world that your spirit was pure and untainted by the shame of your failure. It was a gruesome but powerful way of saying, look inside me. My intentions were pure. My spirit is clean, even if my actions led to failure. It was the most sincere and terrible apology imaginable. Seppuku was not a spontaneous act of desperation. At its highest, most formal level, it was a carefully choreographed ritual, as prescribed and detailed as a tea ceremony or a coronation. It was a public performance, often carried out in front of witnesses, designed to display the samurai's courage, self-control, and adherence to his code, even in the face of an agonizing death. There were several circumstances under which a samurai might be expected, or might choose to commit seppuku. The most straightforward reason was to avoid capture by an enemy. In the brutal warfare of feudal Japan, capture was a fate far worse than death. A captured samurai would be, at best, a source of humiliation for his clan. He might be tortured for information, he would certainly be paraded as a trophy, and then most likely be subjected to a degrading execution like a common criminal. For a samurai, this was an unthinkable defilement of his honor. So, if a battle was lost and defeat was certain, A samurai would often choose to take his own life rather than fall into enemy hands. This was seppuku in its most raw battlefield form. Another common reason was as a form of capital punishment. For a high-ranking samurai who had committed a serious crime, been found guilty of treason, or failed catastrophically in a major command, the shogun or daimyo might sentence him to death, but to simply execute him like a common thief would be to dishonor his entire class, so he would be invited or permitted to commit seppuku. This was a strange and grim act of mercy. It allowed the condemned man to die by his own hand, to preserve a final shred of his honor and the honor of his family, who might otherwise have been stripped of their status and lands. His death was a foregone conclusion, but the manner of it was a final, crucial privilege of his rank. Then there was kanshi, seppuku, as a form of protest. This was perhaps the most dramatic and morally complex form. A samurai, deeply loyal to his lord, might find himself in a position where he believed his lord was acting foolishly, dishonorably, or was being led astray by corrupt advisors. His code of loyalty, chugi, prevented him from directly criticizing or disobeying his master. To do so would be an act of rebellion. So what could he do? He could commit seppuku. It was a way of making the ultimate statement, of shocking his lord into reconsidering his actions. It was a way of saying, "My lord, I am so loyal to you, so concerned for your honor and the welfare of our clan, that I am willing to sacrifice my own life to make you see the error of your ways." It was the ultimate tragic form of loyal dissent. The story of the 47 Ronin, one of Japan's most celebrated tales, is a story born of this kind of protest. Finally, there was a form called junshi, which means, literally, following the lord in death. When a great daimyo died, some of his most loyal and devoted retainers would commit seppuku to accompany him into the afterlife. This was seen as the ultimate expression of loyalty, a demonstration that their service did not end with their master's last breath. This practice was so common at one point that it was eventually outlawed by the Tokugawa shogunate, as it was depriving the clans of their most experienced and loyal warriors. But the ideal persisted. So, let's walk through the ceremony itself, in its most formal expression. Let's imagine a samurai who has been condemned to death for a grave failure. The setting would be carefully chosen. It might be in the garden of a temple, or within the formal reception hall of a mansion. The ground would be covered with white cloths, the color of death and purity in Japan. A space, roughly 2 tatami mats in size, would be prepared. Witnesses, official representatives of the shogunate, or the daimyo, would be seated at a respectful distance. Their job was not to watch a spectacle, but to officially verify that the ritual was carried out correctly and with the proper decorum. The condemned samurai would enter the space after having taken a final bath and dressing in a ceremonial white kimono, the shiroshozoku. The way he wore this kimono was specific. The sleeves would be tucked under his knees to prevent his body from falling backward in an undignified way after the final cut. Even in death, posture was critical. He would kneel in the formal Caesar position, his demeanor calm and composed. His face was expected to be a mask of serene tranquility, betraying no fear, no regret. This was his final performance, and it had to be perfect. Before him, on a small lacquered wooden stand, would be placed the instrument of his death. It was almost always the wakizashi, the shorter of his 2 swords. The long katana was considered too unwieldy for the act. The blade would be wrapped in several sheets of clean white rice paper around the middle, so he could grip it firmly without cutting his own hand. But our samurai was not alone, and this is a crucial point that is often missed in popular depictions. Kneeling just behind him and to his left stood his kaishakunin, or second. This was a role of immense honor and profound responsibility. The kaishakunin was typically a trusted friend, a family member, or a fellow samurai known for his swordsmanship. His job was a grim and merciful one. He was there to perform the daketai, the final cut that would end the samurai's suffering. Why was a second needed? Because death by disembowelment is not instantaneous. It is a slow, agonizing process. The ideal of seppuku was for the samurai to die with his dignity intact, to show his courage, but not to writhe in a prolonged, undignified agony. The kaishakunin was there to ensure a swift and honorable end. Before the act itself, There might be a moment of quiet ritual. The condemned might be offered a final cup of sake, which he would drink in 4 sips. The number 4 shi is a homophone for death in Japan, a deliberate and somber piece of symbolism. He would then compose himself and perhaps recite his death poem, his voice steady and clear. Then, the moment would come. With an expression of utter calm, he would loosen the top of his white kimono, exposing his abdomen. He would pick up the paper-wrapped wakizashi. He would take a deep, steadying breath, and then he would plunge the blade into the left side of his abdomen, below the ribs. He would then draw the blade across his belly to the right side, a deep and excruciating cut. The ideal, rarely achieved, was to then turn the blade in the wound and cut upwards. The physical agony of this act is almost unimaginable. To perform it without crying out, without his face contorting in pain. It was at this moment that the Kaishakunin had to act. He had been standing with his own sword drawn, held at the ready. He had to be a master of timing. He could not strike too early, before the condemned had made his cut, as this would be an insult, suggesting the man lacked the courage to complete the act. He could not wait too long, forcing the man to endure a prolonged agony. He had to watch for the slightest sign, a dip of the head, a flicker in the eyes, that the moment had come. And the cut itself was a matter of supreme skill. The goal was not to sever the head completely. That would be clumsy, sending the head rolling in an undignified manner. The strike, delivered with a single powerful and precise downward blow, was aimed at the neck. The ideal was to leave a small flap of skin at the front, so that the head would fall forward, as if in a final bow, and come to rest cradled in the arms of the deceased. It was a final, terrible act of respect, a gesture of martial elegance at the moment of death. After the blow had fallen and the body had slumped forward, the ceremony was over. The wakizashi would be removed and cleaned. The witnesses would bow respectfully and depart. The body would be prepared for a funeral with all the honors befitting a samurai. He had died, yes, but he had died on his own terms. He had used the ritual of seppuku to wash away his shame with his own blood, and in doing so, he had preserved the one thing that mattered more than life itself, his honor. Now it's important to remember that this highly formal, elaborate ritual was the ideal, often reserved for samurai of high rank in relatively peaceful times. On a chaotic battlefield, things were much grimmer and more rushed. A samurai facing imminent capture would have no time for poetry or white cloths. He might simply kneel on the muddy ground, make a quick deep thrust into his abdomen, and then fall forward on his sword, or ask a nearby comrade to deliver a quick merciful decapitation. The intent was the same, to choose death over dishonor, but the form was dictated by the brutal necessities of the moment. There's a subtle psychology at play here that is worth considering as you rest. The existence of seppuku as a culturally accepted, even lauded option had a profound effect on the samurai mindset. It acted as a kind of psychological safety net. It meant that no matter how badly you failed, no matter how dire your circumstances, there was always a way out. There was always a path that, while terrible, led to the restoration of honor. This knowledge, this ultimate ace up the sleeve, may have allowed samurai to take incredible risks, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. If the worst came to the worst, they had a final, honorable exit strategy. It removed the fear of a shameful, lingering end. It also speaks to a culture that valued the group over the individual, to an extent that we can barely fathom. A samurai's life was not his own. It belonged to his lord and his clan. His death, therefore, was also not his own. The act of seppuku was not a personal choice in the modern sense of asserting individual autonomy. It was a social duty. It was a way of taking responsibility for one's failure, so that the stain of that failure did not spread to the larger group. By dying in this prescribed way, he was cauterizing a wound, preventing the infection of his dishonor from sickening the entire body of his clan. It was his final service. The very idea of seppuku forces us to confront a different way of thinking about life and death, about honor and shame. For us, life is often seen as the ultimate value, something to be preserved at all costs. The samurai code proposed something different. It suggested that there were things more valuable than life. Loyalty was more valuable, duty was more valuable, and honor, that intangible, all-important public face, was certainly more valuable. Life was a tool to be used in the service of these higher ideals, and if that tool became broken or brought shame upon its owner, it was to be honorably discarded. This is not to glorify the practice. It was brutal. It was born of a harsh, unforgiving world, but to dismiss it as simply barbaric is to miss the complex and deeply held philosophy that underpinned it. It was the final logical extension of the Bushido code, a code that demanded a lifetime of self-control, discipline, and the suppression of personal feeling. Seppuku was the last and greatest test of that discipline. It was the final exam in a curriculum of self-mastery. As the story of this solemn ritual fades, and you allow yourself to drift further towards sleep, consider the profound silence of that final act, the hush of the garden, the respectful quiet of the witnesses, the calm, steady voice reciting a final poem, and the terrible, focused silence of a man gathering all of his will, all of his training, all of his being, for one last perfect and devastatingly final act of control. It was the samurai's ultimate rebuttal to the chaos of the world, a way of imposing a final, perfect, and terrible order on his own fate. One final bow, one steadying breath, one honorable end to a life defined by duty. Chapter 6. The sun sets on a warrior class, the Meiji restoration, and the end of an era. We have walked a long and often bloody road with our samurai. We have seen him forged in the unyielding discipline of his youth, have felt the weight of his armor and the soul of his sword. We have stood with him in the quiet tension of a peaceful court and in the terrifying, chaotic heart of a medieval battlefield. We have even borne witness to the final, solemn ritual of Seppuku, the ultimate expression of his code. For centuries, this figure, the samurai, was the apex predator of Japanese society, the political, military, and cultural pillar upon which the entire nation rested. He seemed as permanent and as immovable as Mount Fuji itself. And then, in the span of a single generation, he vanished. This final chapter of our journey is a story of an ending, but it's not the story of a single glorious last stand. It's the story of a slow, bewildering, and often painful fading away. It's the story of how a warrior class, a symbol of ancient tradition, found itself utterly and irrevocably obsolete in the face of a rapidly modernizing world. It's the story of the sun setting on an entire way of life. So, as you settle in for this last part of our tale, let your mind become quiet. Let the world outside your door fall away. We are going to witness the end of an era, not with a bang, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on a treaty, the hiss of a steam engine, and the bewildered silence of a warrior with no one left to fight, and no one left to serve. For over 250 years, since the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 1600s, Japan had been a nation in a self-imposed bubble. The shoguns, wary of foreign influence and the destabilizing effect of Christianity, had enacted a policy of extreme isolation known as sokoku, with a few highly restricted exceptions for the Dutch and Chinese at a single port. No foreigners were allowed in, and no Japanese were allowed out, on pain of death. This policy was remarkably effective. It preserved the peace, and allowed a unique, internally focused Japanese culture to flourish. But it also meant that while the rest of the world was hurtling through the Industrial Revolution, Japan was a nation frozen in time, a perfectly preserved feudal society. The samurai with his swords and spears was the enforcer of this quiet, unchanging world. The first crack in this bubble appeared in 1853. It didn't come in the form of an invading army, but as four strange, menacing shapes that appeared on the horizon of Edo Bay. They were American naval vessels, but they were unlike any ship the Japanese had ever seen. They were not powered by sail and wind, but by steam. They moved against the current with an unnatural power, and they belched thick black smoke into the pristine sky. The Japanese called them the Kurofune, the Black Ships. Their commander, Commodore Matthew Perry, had come with a simple, non-negotiable demand from the President of the United States: open Japan for trade, or face the consequences. And to demonstrate what those consequences might be, Perry had his ships fire their Paison's guns. These were state-of-the-art naval cannons that fired explosive shells. The Japanese, whose own coastal defences consisted of antiquated smoothbore cannons that fired solid balls. watched in stunned silence as these shells arced across the bay and exploded with a terrifying force. In that moment, the entire foundation of the samurai's world was shaken. For centuries, their martial prowess had been the guarantor of Japan's security. But what good was a sword against a cannon that could obliterate a fortress from a mile away? What good was a lifetime of martial arts training against a steam-powered warship? The Black Ships were more than just a military threat. They were a technological and psychological cataclysm. They revealed, in a puff of smoke and a deafening roar, that Japan was no longer the master of its own destiny. The world had moved on, and it had come knocking. The arrival of Perry threw the Tokugawa shogunate into a crisis from which it would never recover. The government, paralyzed by indecision, ultimately capitulated to Perry's demands, signing a treaty that opened Japanese ports to American trade. This was followed by similar unequal treaties with other Western powers. For many of the powerful samurai clans, especially those in the outer domains who had always chafed under Tokugawa rule, this was an unforgivable act of weakness. It was a national humiliation. A powerful sentiment began to grow, summed up in the slogan Son no Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. It was a call to overthrow the weakened shogunate, restore the emperor to his rightful place as the true ruler of Japan. For centuries he had been a powerless, symbolic figurehead in Kyoto, and drive the foreigners back into the sea. This ignited a period of immense turmoil, a decade and a half of political assassinations, small-scale rebellions, and intense factional strife. It was a strange, confused conflict. Samurai, trained for battlefield combat, now found themselves acting as political assassins in the dark alleys of Kyoto, their katanas flashing in the night. It was a final, violent spasm of the old feudal order. But even the most ardent xenophobes began to realize a hard truth. You could not expel the barbarian with swords and spears. The Western powers were simply too technologically advanced. In one famous incident, a British national was killed by samurai for showing disrespect to a daimyo's procession. In retaliation, a squadron of Royal Navy warships sailed up to the clan's capital and systematically bombarded it, reducing much of the city to rubble. The lesson was brutal and clear. To resist the West, Japan had to become like the West. The only way to preserve Japan's independence was to master the very technologies that threatened it. The slogan began to shift. The expel the barbarian part was quietly dropped, and a new idea took its place. Fukoku Kohei, enrich the country, strengthen the army. A group of young, pragmatic and ambitious samurai, mostly from the outer clans, realized that Japan needed a radical top-to-bottom transformation, and the shogunate, with its rigid, archaic structure, was standing in the way. This culminated in 1868, in a short, relatively bloodless conflict known as the Boshin War. It was a civil war, but it looked very different from the battles of the past. On one side, the forces of the shogunate, still largely a traditional samurai army. On the other, the armies of the imperial faction, led by the revolutionary young samurai. And these new armies were different. They were armed with modern rifles, like the French chassepot and the American Spencer repeating rifle. They were organized into Western-style infantry units. They wore Western-style uniforms, and most shockingly of all, they were a conscript army, made up largely of commoners, farmers and townsmen, who had been drilled in the use of a rifle. In battle after battle, the results were tragically predictable. The traditional samurai, with their swords and their code of honor, charged forward with immense bravery, only to be cut down in disciplined volleys of rifle fire from an army of peasants. The individual skill of the greatest swordsman in Japan meant nothing against a farmer he couldn't even see, hiding behind a tree 100 yards away, armed with a modern firearm. The age of the warrior was over. The age of the soldier had begun. The shogunate was defeated. The last shogun abdicated, and the young emperor Meiji was restored to power. This event, the Meiji Restoration, was not just a change of government. It was a revolution that would utterly remake Japanese society with breathtaking speed. The new leaders, the same young samurai who had led the revolution, were now in charge, and they knew that the very class they belonged to, the samurai class, was the single greatest obstacle to the modern nation they envisioned. The samurai system, with its hereditary stipends, its rigid social hierarchy, and its emphasis on archaic martial arts was an expensive, inefficient anachronism. In order to save Japan, the samurai had to be destroyed. The process was carried out with a calm, surgical, and utterly ruthless efficiency. It was a step-by-step dismantling of an entire way of life. First, in 1869, the daimyo were persuaded to voluntarily return their domains to the emperor. In a single stroke, this eliminated the feudal fiefdoms that had been the basis of samurai power for 700 years. The samurai were no longer vassals of a local lord. They were now, in theory, direct retainers of the emperor. Then, in 1871, the class distinctions themselves were formally abolished. The old four-tiered system of samurai, farmer, artisan and merchant was dissolved. All Japanese were now, in theory, commoners, equal before the law. But the samurai were still being paid their hereditary stipends, a massive drain on the new government's treasury. So in 1873, these rice stipends were converted into government bonds. It was a lump sum payout, but the interest rates were low, and the value was often far less than their old income. For many lower-ranking samurai, who had already been living in a state of genteel poverty, this was a financial disaster. They were cut adrift, forced to find a way to make a living in a new capitalist economy, for which they had absolutely no skills. A man who could compose a flawless haiku, and was a master of the spear, was suddenly finding his resume wasn't getting a lot of traction in the job market. But the most symbolic, most psychologically devastating blow came in 1876, with the Haitore Edict. This law forbade the wearing of swords in public. It was a simple decree, but its impact was profound. The daisho, the two swords that had been the exclusive badge of samurai rank, the physical manifestation of their soul, were now illegal to carry. To see a samurai walking down the street without his swords was like seeing a priest without his vestments, a king without his crown. It was a public stripping of their identity. The soul of the samurai was by government decree to be locked away in a closet. Imagine our samurai, who we have followed for so long. He might now be in his 40s or 50s. He has survived battles. He has served his lord loyally. He has lived his entire life according to a strict, demanding code. And now, in the span of a few short years, his entire world has been pulled out from under him. His lord is gone. His social status has been erased. His income has been slashed. And now, he cannot even wear the swords that define him. He is a relic in his own lifetime. He walks through the streets of a city that is changing with bewildering speed. He sees men with Western-style haircuts, wearing Western suits. He sees telegraph wires being strung. He hears the whistle of a steam train, a sound like a scream from a future he does not understand. He is a ghost at the feast of modernity. For many, this was too much to bear. The loss of status, the economic hardship, and the deep sense of betrayal led to a series of last-gasp samurai rebellions. The most famous of these was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by one of the great heroes of the Meiji Restoration, a man named Saigo Takamori. He was a perfect embodiment of the samurai ideal, a physically powerful, deeply principled man who had become disillusioned with the new government he had helped create. He became a reluctant leader for thousands of disaffected, unemployed samurai who saw the old ways being trampled underfoot. They made their last stand at the Battle of Shiroyama. It was a tragic, heroic, and utterly futile final act. A few hundred samurai, armed mostly with swords, spears, and a few old muskets, charged the entrenched positions of the new Imperial Japanese Army, an army of 30,000 conscripts armed with modern rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns. It was a slaughter. Saigo, wounded in the charge, committed seppuku with the help of a loyal retainer. His death marked the definitive end of the samurai as a military force. It was the last battle. The sun had finally set. But what happened to the millions of other samurai, the ones who didn't die in a final glorious charge? Their stories are quieter, less dramatic, but in many ways more poignant. They had to find a way to survive in this brave new world. For the highest-ranking samurai, the former daimyo and their senior advisors, the transition was relatively smooth. They were absorbed into the new Meiji oligarchy, becoming politicians, industrialists, and high-ranking military officers. They simply traded their swords for briefcases and their kimono for frock coats. But for the vast majority of the lower and middle-ranking samurai, it was a struggle for survival. They had been trained for two things: fighting and administration. The fighting jobs were gone, replaced by the new conscript army. But their administrative skills, their high levels of literacy, their discipline, and their deep-seated sense of duty turned out to be surprisingly valuable. Many of them became the backbone of the new Japan. They became school teachers, educating the next generation. They became policemen, keeping order in the rapidly growing cities. They became clerks and mid-level managers in the new government ministries and the burgeoning corporations, the zaibatsu. They brought their samurai ethos, their commitment to discipline, loyalty, and selfless service into the very DNA of modern Japanese corporate and government culture. The samurai spirit did not die. It just put on a suit and tie and went to work in an office. Others were not so lucky. Some, proud and unable to adapt, slid into poverty and despair. Some tried their hand at farming or commerce, occupations they had been taught to despise for centuries, and often failed spectacularly. There are heartbreaking stories of master swordsmen ending their days as rickshaw pullers or street vendors, their calloused hands, once trained to wield a katana with deadly grace, now used for menial labor. They were men out of time, casualties of progress. And what of the samurai's code, Bushido? In a world without samurai, the way of the warrior underwent a strange transformation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was romanticized and repackaged. It was stripped of its messy feudal context and reinvented as a kind of national spiritual essence, the Japanese spirit, or Yamato Damashi. It was used by the rising tide of Japanese nationalism and militarism to instill a sense of absolute loyalty and self-sacrifice, not to a feudal lord, but to the emperor and the state. The samurai ideal, once the code of an elite warrior class, was now being taught to every schoolchild and every soldier in the new imperial army. This rebranding of Bushido would have devastating consequences in the decades to come, leading Japan down the path to aggressive expansionism, and ultimately to the catastrophe of the Second World War. The ghost of the samurai was being marshalled for a new and far more terrible kind of war. So as our long story comes to its close, and you feel yourself drifting on the edge of sleep, let's hold a final image in our minds. It's not the image of a warrior in full armor, or a duelist under the cherry blossoms. Let's picture an old man, perhaps in the early years of the 20th century. He sits on the veranda of a small, modest home. He is wearing a simple, drab kimono. His hair is cut short in the Western style. His hands are old and wrinkled, but they still hold a memory of strength. Inside his house, on a stand in a dusty alcove, rests his daisho. The swords are perfectly preserved, their lacquer gleaming, their silk bindings immaculate. But they are silent. They have not been drawn in decades. They are no longer a soul, but a souvenir. He looks out at a world he no longer recognizes, a world of factories and trains, of newspapers and telephones, a world without lords, without castles, without the rigid, comforting certainties of his youth. He is the last samurai. His life has been a bridge between two completely different worlds. He was born in a feudal society that had existed almost unchanged for centuries, and he will die in a modern industrial nation that is now a major world power. He has seen it all. He has lost it all, and yet he endures. He has survived. He carries within him the memory of a way of life, a code of honor that has vanished from the face of the earth. His legacy, and the legacy of his entire class, is stitched invisibly into the fabric of the new Japan, in its discipline, its dedication, its sense of duty. The warrior is gone, but the way of the warrior, in 1,000 different transformed ways, lives on. The sun set, yes, but it left behind a long and profound and often haunting afterglow. One final quiet breath, one silent memory, one long slow fade to black,